Okay, good afternoon, everybody. A few people are still joining, but in the interest of time, let's get started. You're very welcome to this OGP Europe Dialogues webinar on civic space. I'm Paul Braithwaite, Regional Lead for Europe at OGP, and I'll be co-moderating today's session along with Tim Hughes, who's our lead for democracy and participation. So Europe Dialogues is OGP's webinar series for the open government community. It's intended to connect EU and European policy priorities with national OGP processes and the people driving them. So, a few housekeeping items before we begin. Today's event will be recorded. So, if you don't want your face appearing in the recording, please do turn off your camera. Um, Translation is available if needed. We're using Wordly, which you can access using the instructions on the screen. So you can scan the QR code with your phone, or you can use the web link at the bottom of the slide. We'll leave this slide here for a few minutes. Please do also introduce yourself in the chat. Give us your name, your organization, and if you like, why this topic is important to you. And we will have an opportunity for questions and discussion later in the webinar. So please consider what you might want to raise with the panelists as we go along, and feel free to post those questions or comments in the chat as well. So our topic today is civic space, and civic space refers to the freedom of citizens, civil society organizations, journalists, and others to operate, assemble, participate, and express themselves freely without fear of censorship, reprisal, or oppression. It's the foundation of democratic participation and open government, because without it, people can't meaningfully engage in decision making, scrutinize government action, or hold politicians accountable. Civic space is also fundamental to economic prosperity, social progress, and democratic health. We are meeting at a difficult time. The evidence across Europe points to a clear pattern of decline over the past decade, and that has accelerated, in fact, since the late 2010s. So we have seen a shift from largely open civic space towards more narrowed or obstructed conditions in many countries. But at the same time, this isn't just a story of decline. Civil society also continues to mobilize, and there are bright spots, including new strategies, some of which we'll hear about today, stronger institutional engagement, and practical reforms at both EU and national levels. And this is where I think OGP can add value. OGP is an action mechanism that helps bring different reform communities together to be more than the sum of their parts. It supports co-creation between government and civil society, and it focuses attention on the delivery of measurable and achievable commitments. The OGP model itself of co-creation between government and civil society is itself an expression of civic space, and over 80% of OGP members have an established multi-stakeholder forum. The civic space is already an important part of the OGP story in Europe. European members have made altogether 79 commitments on civic space across 23 countries since 2011, and that has covered areas like protection of journalists and media freedom, the transparency of civil society funding, the simplification of the registration and legal environment for civil society, stronger participation and dialogue with civil society, and funding and support for civic actors in restrictive contexts. Whilst we have seen something of a drop-off in recent years, we do continue to see new commitments. Just last year, we had commitments such as simplifying the procedures for registering NGOs in Bosnia and Herzegovina, or passing legislation in Spain to protect the professional secrecy of journalists. Civic space is also a key priority in OGP's strategy for 2023 to 2028. Nevertheless, when we compare with other policy areas, it is true that we see fewer commitments on civic space compared to, say, anti-corruption. So today we'd like to explore the challenges that are driving that trend, but we also want to be practical and solution focused and discuss where OGP and OGP national processes can help move reforms forward. So we have two great panels, the first of which will look at the state of civic space in Europe, the key challenges, as well as some broad-based recommendations for action. And the second panel will zero in on some bright spots, examples of civil society strategies in particular, which have recently been developed at national and regional levels. So before we introduce the first panel, we'd like to hear a little bit more from you, our attendees, in terms of what you already know about civic space and what it means for you. So we have a couple of Mentimeter questions for you. So you can join either on your phone by scanning the QR code on the slide, or you can just open a new tab on your browser and go to menti.com and enter the code. So just give people a minute or two to join that, and then we'll launch our first question. I can't quite see the number of how many people have joined, but Karina, whenever you think it's enough, we can go to the first question. So the first question, simply, civic spaces is a topic I know a lot about already. Do you agree or disagree with that? Just to get a measure of who's in the room in terms of your comfort with the topic and familiarity. Looks like a fairly well-informed group. Give a couple more minutes for people to respond. Oh, we've gone already. Okay, second question. So in terms of what you think about in terms of what civic space means to you, what would be some of the keywords you associate with civic space? And I think you can put in a few different ones. And this will give us a bit of a word cloud in terms of what you associate with civic space. So freedom and democracy standing out boldly there, which is great to see. And then a whole cluster of other words, freedom of expression, funding, independence, participation, freedom of association, and many more besides. I think we have 25 people taking part so far. Another 10 seconds maybe for some final contributions. You can continue inputting this and we will share the word cloud afterwards. So even if you can still input things, I think, after we unshare the screen. But yeah, as you can see there, some standout words. Accountability is there as well, another core OGP value, and lots of others. But a very rich set of concepts there associated with civic space, which is really helpful just in terms of setting the scene for our conversation. Okay, thank you for that input, and we'll come back to you with a couple more questions as we go along. Um, and just to reiterate for those who were joining during my introduction there, we will have an opportunity for conversation and discussion later. So do be thinking of questions and that you might want to ask the panelists. And after both panels have finished, we'll have an opportunity to have an open discussion. So I'm going to hand over to Tim now, and he's going to introduce our first panel.
Thank you very much, Paul. So I'm Tim Hughes. I'm the lead for democracy and participation at OGP. So I lead on the civic space topic across our membership. And we're going to jump straight in to look at the state of civic space in Europe. So particularly looking at some of the key trends, challenges, and solutions. And we've got a fantastic panel to address this. So as you can see on the screen there, we'll be hearing from Katerina Hadji and Makiva Evans from ECNL, Kareem Bad from the OECD, and Andres Accardo from the Fundamental Rights Agency. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Katerina to start us off. Katerina, as well as being the director of ECNL, is a steering committee member for OGP. And she has worked across civil society organisations, movements, and governments for many years, supporting reforms to open and to strengthen civic space. So over to you, Katerina.
Thank you so much, Paul and team, and really wonderful to be here with all of colleagues and partners we see in the community. Let me open the conversation with three long-standing trends and threats that are becoming more sophisticated, three emerging concerns we haven't fully grappled with, some genuine bright lights, and how OGP can help us act on all of it. But it was interesting to see the word cloud we just did, because I really wanted to speak about, to start framing this conversation exactly with that. And that's the intersection of the state of democracy and our freedom to organize, mobilize, and draw resources. And what we are seeing is that the state of democracy and the state of freedom are moving in the same direction, and so far is not really a good one. So let me start with the democracy picture. According to the most recent VDEM report, democracy has retreated to 1978 levels for the average global citizen. In Western Europe and North America, it is at the lowest point in over 50 years. Europe is significantly affected, not just Greece or the Western Balkans or Eastern Europe, but also UK, Italy, Romania, and others. They're all showing authoritarian trends. And repression of civil society has surged, now affecting 68% of the countries. Freedom of expression and freedom of association are the second and third most affected dimension of democracy globally. CSO repression now sits second on the list of declining indicators, just behind media censorship. And I want to dwell on Western Europe specifically because this research of Vidam and many others point to an uncomfortable truth we've been raising for some time, but which is now impossible to ignore. And we have to work with this. That's the fact that the erosion of global rights, multilateral order, hasn't happened only because authoritarians were pushing against it, but it's also because countries from Western Europe, the US, the UK have been exhibiting authoritarian tendencies themselves. Now, there is always good news, and the good news from the Vidam report is that countries that are democratizing are few, but when U-turns happen, they have high success rate, and this really gives us hope seeing Hungary now. The majority of the Western European countries remain predominantly democracies. And really, this is the framework we have to be working with. This is where we have opportunities and instruments to reverse the trend, and we need to use them. But let me start first with the long-standing restrictions. What we are seeing is that they're getting sharper. We are working with monitoring reports for Europe, which are called MAX and CSO meter, but we are also relying on reports of FRA and others to understand really what's happening. And I want to speak about how these long-standing restrictions are getting sharper because it means that we are not doing enough about it. So the first one is funding restrictions. Foreign funding laws are becoming an all-basket category. They now target civil society simultaneously through lobby restrictions, money laundering accusations, and national security, foreign election interference framing, you name it. Even when such legislation doesn't pass, the harassment and stigmatization continue. CSO and activists are being pressured into exile. And with that, transnational repression follows them across border. Number two, the right to protest. We are seeing an alarming normalization of laws and practices that criminalize peaceful protest. It can't be acceptable in democracies. Authorities use procedural tools, relocation orders, public order justification to reduce visibility and impact. And this is important because it's not just about criminalization and arrests. Assemblies are excluded from public events, municipal venue, and areas where they can really reach those they want to speak to. And new legislation is expanding executive and police powers, increasing the risk of criminalization and surveillance. Number three, there was something that has been developing for a while, but is increasing, is the financial access and banking restrictions. This is due to the anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing regulations, and this is where we need to also look at EU and its approach to it, not just the national level. But these kind of regulations are affecting increasingly how civil society accesses and moves money, including groups working in exile. Such regulations make difficult fundraising via crowdfunding platforms and virtual currencies, and this is exactly hitting us at the moment when the funding is shrinking. Now, cutting across all of these three trends is the role of soft restrictions, which I mentioned earlier, like administrative burdens, strategic litigation, bureaucratic obstacles, which are less visible, but with significant chilling effects. And therefore, detection and prevention matters as much as response. Now, three emerging trends. Number one, civil disobedience is increasing in the population because people feel unheard. But the crackdown on these kind of acts is intensifying and affects groups working on climate, migration, and conflict-related issues. And this is not just about people. Entire organizations, for example, those working on migration at sea, have had their activities banned. People, young and old, are charged under terrorism laws for such acts. And these are peaceful civil disobedience acts which are enshrined in international law. These restrictions have therefore intergenerational impact and cut in the essence of people activism and participation. Number two, we are seeing a trend where social media platforms are restricting civil society reach and in part to broad interpretation of the EU transparency and targeted political advertising regulation. Under Meta's ruling and reading, for example, if you're an influencer, you're treated as an advertiser, meaning you can't amplify or work with organizations and amplify their messages on major social issues. This is an emerging trend. We're trying to understand and see exactly how it's manifesting in practice, but it's really important because we can't allow civil society groups and people who want to speak up to lose visibility at the moment where they need the most. And finally, national security exemptions are creeping into legal framework and practices, including those of the Council of Europe, the EU, and countries themselves. The lines between national security, law enforcement, and national defense are blurring, and some states are exploiting this ambiguity to deny access to information about how they deploy digital tools and AI system or use these tools to surveil activists and protesters and people. What are the three bright lights? Number one, I was thinking whether to start with this because you're going to be speaking about it and others in the panel, but I really wanted to emphasize the importance of government strategies for civil society collaboration. Now, I have worked in this area for about 25 years, and historically what we have seen is that these strategies have been more important than just a document. They have been the space for dialogue, for building understanding, and for reversing restrictions. And when decline starts, they are the first to go. So they matter, and I encourage you all to engage with them. Second, we can call this kind of bright spot a radical coalition. These practices of forming coalitions between groups that are being affected are becoming an increased method for civil society to defend this space. And indeed, because the laws that we are now talking about, they're not just affecting civil society, they're affecting populations, they're affecting banks, business associations, influencers, lawyers, even authorities like the anti-money laundering authorities. So when we have seen this kind of radical coalitions forming, then we have found out that it's possible to reverse the laws like that are targeting us. And those examples come from Hungary, Netherlands, Slovakia, Bulgaria. So we really can work with bridging beyond our own silo. And number three, people are still showing up. We have seen large-scale mobilization continues to demonstrate commitment to democratic participation and support for civil society. I want to raise two examples. One that is from Hungary, where LGBTQI community march continued, was massive despite of the ban. And number two, most recent, there was a Durham Pride in the UK banned by the new Reform Council. And they try to actually reduce funding to it so that they can minimize its possibility to happen. But instead, the mining community stepped up and managed to support it and even increase significantly the money for it to happen. So, these are really important stories. They are not just footnotes. We need to really work with them and capitalize them. And finally, Paul, and you spoke about where OGP comes in and why it's important. I want to really emphasize that. I think at the time of multilateralism, where we are trying to find our space, voice, and engage, OGP provides us with that platform and enables us to bring these diverse communities and collaborations I have been talking about. And I really hope those states here, those that are joining us through the audience and others will really think about how they can use this space to better reach out to communities and work together to solve the things that we want to focus on. I would really hope that also many of the countries engaging with the open government can actually focus on the civic space aspect. Paul, you spoke about, that we need to do more about it. We have the Open Government Challenge, which can help surface good examples and also inspire others, but it can also help us work with more interesting examples of how we can really reverse the trends. And I really want to kind of highlight the Civic Space Labs, which were recently launched by OGP, which can really provide that space we need for innovation, creation, and responses we need at this moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Katerina, for that. You paint a stark picture of the trends and the challenges that are facing civic space across the region, and I think it's really important to emphasise the point you made that this isn't something that's just affecting some parts of Europe, but to a large extent impacting on all countries in some way. But fantastic also to have the reasons for hope and optimism as well. And thank you also for referring to some of the things that OGP can help with. And I think we'll come back to that a bit later. But next up, I'm going to call on Karine Bad from the OECD. So Karine is a policy analyst at OECD and particularly leads OECD's work on civic space. So over to you, Karine.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. It's a pleasure to be joining you today. I will be as brief as possible because the most interesting part is the exchanges at the end. And I'll just give you 2-3 points, starting off with a very simple one. Why is it that the OECD actually works on civic space? And you've kind of heard some of the challenges facing civic space in Europe, but I just want to go back to really one key element from our perspective, which is the voice gap. Essentially, the studies and the research that we've been doing at the OECD point a picture of a very evolving relationship between governments and their citizens. Citizens today expect not only to be informed, but to be meaningfully involved in shaping the decisions that affect their lives. And we do a number of studies linked to what helps make citizens trust public institutions. And our evidence shows that this expectations of wanting to be involved in shaping how policies and decisions are being made, it's not always met. Fewer than 4 in 10 people across OECD countries feel that they have a say in what their government does. If I give you more or less a stats, 69% of those who feel like they have a say trust their government more, trust their public institutions more, and this goes to 22% when they do not feel like they can influence policy making. And so for us, this perceived lack of voice is really a critical challenge for democracies. Katerina really mentioned a lot of extremely insightful points that link also to this changing relationship between citizens and public institutions. We're seeing that citizens, different segments of the populations, are really engaging in new ways, whether it's civic mobilization, how they're using digital platforms, community action, often outside of formal institutional channels. And what we're seeing from the OECD side is that governments are often struggling to connect the civic energy with actual policy making. And so this is creating this growing gap between people who are not disengaged, with people who want to participate actively in public life, just differently or in a more meaningful manner. And we're seeing this growing gap between how this is perceived and how then decisions are being made. And so the issue is that this gap is not neutral. If left unaddressed, it can feel frustration, generate polarization, and actually disengagement. But if addressed well, we really consider it to represent a major opportunity for governments to really renew democratic governance and make policymaking more effective and more responsive. So this is a long introduction just to kind of say that this is, in this context, the OECD findings are clear. A thriving civic space is essential for meaningful citizen and stakeholder participation in public life. That is why we are working on civic space from that particular angle. And this is where we see the complementarity of our work when you look at all the different partners that look into it. So what we recognize when we talk about civic space, it's an essential prerequisite for effective participation. And I'm happy to have seen in the World Cloud that participation, when you think of civic space, for many people, participation is one of these elements. When civic space is protected, individuals and CSOs feel more safe and more empowered to participate in public life, to voice their concerns, to advocate for change without fear of retribution. And this is the angle that we're looking at. We also, of course, have seen through our research that a protected civic space encourages a diversity of voices to engage in democratic processes, which strengthens the quality of this involvement. And then one last point on why the rationale around this is we really see the connection between protected civic space and public participation as a mutually reinforcing one. So civic space protection enables the public to engage openly and constructively, while robust public participation in turn strengthens and legitimizes the protections that sustain civic space. And so that is kind of the overarching element for us. I had a nice little paragraph or section on challenges, but Katerina really covered them really well. I won't bore you with them. We have done kind of a focus on challenges at the European level. So if anyone's interested, happy to go into those. But I mean, we have like maybe 4 or 5 very quickly. The persistent gap between legal and mostly from a governance perspective. I should have mentioned that I'm from the Public Governance Directorate, so that is our bread and butter. So from our side, what we see is the persistent gap between legal frameworks and implementation. So sometimes formal protections actually coexist with restrictive practices, disproportionate sanctions, uneven enforcement, things like that. Fragmentation and siloed governance. Responsibilities for civic space are really spread across institutions, and this includes a lot of challenges from a coordination perspective. Chilling effects on freedom of expression specifically. Legal and practical shortcomings in assembly governance. And then two last points, the structural weaknesses in the enabling environment for civil society. The last element, which is a nice transition to my last point, is on one of the key challenges that we're seeing also in Europe is this insufficient, fragmented, and lack of disaggregated data on civic space, which is really limiting effective monitoring of civic space in practice, including on assemblies, including on SLAPs, CSO registration, funding, etc. Like coming into the space, essentially, I was kind of almost surprised when we ask governments sometimes questions that for us would be simple, like, can you give us, how many CSOs do you fund, or like just simple questions that you would think would be an easy one for a government to respond to, and it's actually not that easy for them, even for the ones that are really working in depth on these topics. So if Paul hasn't given me yet a red flag, I'll just end with a few words on monitoring, if that's okay. One of the most distinctive contributions of the OECD is that on all topics, public governance topics, is that we collect comparable data, and in this case on civic space. We do it directly from governments. We use a very robust methodology that includes extensive data validation, and we, of course, work in complementarity with the valuable monitoring efforts of CSOs and of partner organizations. But what we are trying to do is to bring in a comparative, neutral, and sort of evidence-based international perspective that can turn diagnosis into reform progressively. Obviously, there are kind of what we're trying to go about this is that this is an area that would benefit from more informed, evidence-based policy making, and that's the gap that we are trying to fill. You can read more about this in our global report on civic space, which was based on a 2020 survey on open government, which benefited from extensive testing and guidance from the OECD Observatory of Civic Space, which includes a number of international partners that have really guided our efforts in this space, including many of the institutions that are present on this call. And I'm very pleased to announce that we will soon be launching the second edition of the survey, which includes an extensive section on civic space. It has taken a long time in the making, one, because we've learned so much from the first iteration, and also we've received a lot of advice from the Observatory of Civic Space, but also from the OECD Network for Public Officials working on civic space. So this network has done 4 or 5 meetings. The last one we did in person for Europe, specifically in collaboration with FRA, and they have been really helpful in trying to guide us to what are the most important questions that we need to be asking and what kind of data is useful to complement. So last point is that beyond the data, we also work closely with governments on the ground. So we've now conducted, I think, more than 10 civic space country reviews overall, accessing laws, policies, institutions, and practices, and then identifying what works and what can be improved. The latest one, or the upcoming one, you should be able to read soon, is on Australia. And thanks to the support of EEA and Norway grants, we have just not too long ago embarked on a new project with 5 countries in Europe. So Czechia, Estonia, Croatia, Lithuania, and Bulgaria. We will be doing these country reviews alongside targeted capacity building. I'll end with that, just to mention that on capacity building specifically, we've developed the practical guide for policymakers on this space, and this will be kind of our reference point for this type of activity on capacity building. So I really hope we'll continue to see more synergies between the open government agenda and the civic space agenda. And just mentioning, you can absolutely count on the OECD for support and guidance in these efforts, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. That's it for me.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Corinne. And thank you particularly for making that link between civic space, participation and trust in a time where we're all concerned about declining trust in public institutions. Improving civic space and opportunities for public participation, it's clear to see from the OECD evidence that is an evidence-based way that that governments can counter that trust deficit. And fantastic also to hear about all of the work that OECD is doing on this. I very much recommend people to look at OECD's monitoring work. Should also have mentioned earlier the work that Katerina mentioned by Max as well on monitoring across Europe on civic space. As we also have quite a few policymakers on this call, I'd also recommend you to take a look at OECD's practical guide for policymakers on protecting and promoting civic space. We often hear from people this question of, well, you keep telling us that civic space is in decline, but what can we do about it? That is one place to look from a policymaker perspective at the sorts of reforms and things that can be introduced. So now on to our final speaker of this first panel. So I'm going to hand over to Andreas Accardo, who is Head of Unit for Institutional Cooperation and the EU Charter at the EU Fundamental Rights Agency. Over to you, Andreas.
Thank you, Tim, and a pleasure to be with all of you. I don't have a hell of a lot of different messages than those that the two Ks have just shared with you, Karin and Katarina. But to start with, I wanted to underpin what they've said with some of our own data, just to a little bit confirm what they have been sharing in terms of challenges faced by civil society. As I think most of you know, the agency has been monitoring the civic space in the European Union since roughly 10 years now. We've looked at legal and policy developments in all the member states. But I think what I want to add here is something that we do quite uniquely, is that we are consulting civil society organizations about their experiences with civic space. And we have actually just closed the last consultation, because we do that on an annual basis, with a record number of 700 organizations that have replied to our latest consultation. But I will be sharing with you the results, as we haven't analyzed the results of the latest consultation before, in terms of experiences for civil society. So if I can ask the OGP colleagues to share the graph. So I just wanted to show to you how over the years, because we always say, you know, civic space is shrinking, how over the years civil society organizations participating in our consultations have been describing the general conditions for their work. And as you can see in the first graph, that since 2019 to 2024, there has been a deterioration in the perception, let's say, of the conditions for civil society organizations to work on human rights and democracy issues in the European Union. And it's particularly stark for the EU level, where you see that we had in 2019 40% saying that the conditions were either good or very good. And now we have actually reached almost half, by 20% level of organizations saying that the conditions have been very good or good at EU level. And then the second graph I want to share with you is about the type of threats and attacks that civil society organizations are experiencing according to these surveys that we do. And you see also here that the level of threats and attacks over the past years have risen. And in particular, if you look at the ones that are most frequently reported are smear campaigns, cyber attacks, politically motivated funding cuts, and the criminalization of civil society work. So I just wanted to share that from the outset with you, to a little bit of some data from our side that in a way confirms what Katarina and Karin were saying in terms of challenges. And that's going to be my only slide. So secondly, I wanted to speak to you about when there's a lot of talk, let's say, about shrinking. Thank you. You can, yeah, thanks. There's a lot of talk about enabling civic space, obstructed civic space, narrowing civic space. And what I wanted to break it down in a bit of some concrete pillars. What do we mean concretely by that? And how could you actually measure that? So of course, there are different ways how to measure it. And I will be speaking on how the agency has been measuring civic space, just to offer you some kind of conceptual framework. So we have broken down the civic space into 4 different pillars. One is the regulatory environment for civil society to work. Secondly is access to funding. And thirdly is participation in policy and lawmaking. And the last and the fourth area is protection from threats and attacks. So these are the four pillars that we are using in our own reporting on civic space. And I want to fill these pillars a little bit with contents. So on the regulatory environment, Katharina spoke about this already. We look at how is the legal environment for civil society developing. And here we're not looking at only intentional impacts on shrinking the civic space, but also some unintentional effects. And I think, Katharina, you spoke about those already. What we're seeing in recent years in particular is that freedom of assembly is coming under particular pressure, both because of some new legislation being passed, but also how the law is applied in practice. By public safety rules being interpreted very conservatively, or by additional measures being put in place, like surveillance measures, even drones being used, facial recognition being used or threatened to be used. So we have seen that in terms of the regulatory environment, freedom of assembly is one of the areas most under threat. Then the second area, access to funding. I already spoke about these funding cuts as one of the main threats that civil society are experiencing. In our latest consultation, actually half of the organizations that responded said that they had witnessed unexpected funding cuts in the middle of the year, and they had suspected that those were due to political reasons. And we see that in particular advocacy work of civil society organizations is suffering from funding cuts. And the third area, participation in lawmaking, in a way, Karin already covered it very well. But a few things to mention there is that very few countries have sort of legally binding rules on consulting with civil society. Maybe that's something to look at. We see that civil society consultation is quite often skipped because of excessive use of emergency legislation, and this tends to be the most fundamental rights or human rights sensitive legislation. And there, governments tend to cut a few corners. There's also a bit of a lack of transparency on who is consulted and also the outcomes of these consultations. And the last area I want to say is protection from threats and attacks. I've mentioned already the type of attacks that civil society organizations are facing. And here we see that many organizations actually not reporting these incidents to law enforcement, even sort of criminal acts. When we're asking organizations why they're not reporting them, they say they have been dissatisfied with their experience when they brought these attacks to the police, or they believe that nothing would happen if they would be raising it. So that's a little bit the four pillars I wanted to cover and how we fill them with contents. So since I realize I'm the bridge to the next session, sort of on the bright spots and what can we do about all of this, I just wanted to leave you with three thoughts as a bridge. We've just published our latest Civic Space report, and there we have put the emphasis on three particular suggestions where we would suggest that improvements could be made. One is on strengthening the monitoring. Karin already spoke about the lack of data. We believe it's not only a lack of data, but it's also the need to bring this all together. This is why the agency will be actually creating, under the civil society strategy, and maybe Estelle will be speaking a little bit more about that, of a network of all organizations active in monitoring the civic space so that we can compare notes and also pool the data a little bit more, make it more easily accessible through an online knowledge hub. And also make sure that following the monitoring, also action follows, because sometimes there's a little bit of a gap. We all highlight some issues, but then there's maybe things get a little bit lost in translation. So strengthening monitoring would be one of the suggestions we would have. Secondly is and I'm glad to see that we will hear from countries that are active on that. We believe it would be good to develop more sort of structured approaches to civil society engagement through strategies or national frameworks for civil society engagement, which would have a targeted focus on civic space. And I'm looking forward to the colleagues that will be presenting that. I think the EU civil society strategy can be sort of, let's say, maybe a platform, a roadmap for us, a blueprint for that. And we hope that many member states will be following that example and also have then national civil society strategies. And I'm glad that OGP and others will be helping, and also OECD will be helping with that. And then lastly, it's on the issue of civil society participation. We see that in terms of lawmaking in particular, there are major gaps. We have published a report just last year on how to measure human rights impacts during lawmaking. And we see that, first of all, very often this is being skipped, human rights impact assessments. But also here we see that there's much scope to have much more let's say, legally binding or clear rules on how to engage with society during lawmaking processes. And in case, urgency procedures are being used, a proper justification why, an urgency procedure is needed or not. And because we see major risks in terms of legislation being approved for human rights, major risk if legislation is approved without proper impact assessment, where civil society would be involved. It's an issue of good governance, as Karin has said, but it's also an issue of potentially legislation being adopted that would be in violation of human rights. And there we see that proper civil society, meaningful civil society participation can be one of the safety nets for governments to make sure that this is not going to happen. So that's from my side, looking forward to discussions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Thank you for outlining those areas of opportunity as well as the challenges. I can recommend to everyone to look at FRA's recent report. It gives a really good overview of what different member states across Europe are doing on civic space across those different areas that Andreas spoke about. So it's good as a comparative as well to kind of understand where your country may be strong or weak and what other countries are doing on those issues as well. So we're going to shift gear a little bit in keeping with, I guess, where Andreas left us. So we're now kind of shifting to think a bit more towards maybe the opportunities and the bright spots. So we have another Mentimeter poll, and we've borrowed the 4 pillars that Andreas spoke us through there. So regulatory environment for civil society, funding for civil society, participation of civil society and the public in decision-making, and threats and attacks on activists, journalists, and civil society organisations. So the question is, for each of those, how likely do you think positive reform is in each of these aspects of civic space in the next 2 to 3 years in your country? So if you go back onto the Menti, you should see a slider for each of those, which you can pull across to the left if you think it's very unlikely that there will be positive reform on that aspect, or to the right if you think it's very likely. And hopefully we'll start to get a picture of where some of the opportunities across the region are. So already seeing that sort of final one on threats and attacks on activists, journalists and civil society organisations, people are a bit more positive there that there may be some positive reform. And perhaps unsurprisingly, people are most pessimistic about funding for civil society. We'll keep this open for another 30 seconds or so. We're up to 12 respondents at the moment. I think it's interesting to see that you can see the distribution as well, and some of them are quite spread out. So particularly the bottom 2, there's people who are both pessimistic and optimistic with their country about those. It looks so the regulatory environment and funding for civil society, those are a bit more towards the pessimistic end of the spectrum. So maybe final 10 seconds for anybody else to respond. Okay, no, it's looking as though we've maxed out at 19, but we will keep that open if anybody else wants to respond to it as we move to our next panel. And I'll hand back to Paul to moderate that panel.
Thanks, Tim. And yeah, thank you to our first set of panelists, and thanks to all of you for your inputs on the audience poll. What I also take away from that poll is I note that I think all of the 4 components were a little bit below the middle, so perhaps feeling that reform is more unlikely than likely. So, which is a very understandable position to take given the outlook and all of the challenges ahead of us. But I guess the task of our second panel is to try and inject a little bit of optimism in terms of a few bright spots, and we promise to be very pragmatic on the aspects of civic space where some forward motion is happening in particular places. So we have 3 more speakers. We're going to hear from Estelle Massé, who works in fundamental rights policy at DG Just in the European Commission. Then we'll hear from Kieran Moylan, who's in the Irish Government's Department for Rural Community Development and the Gaeltacht. And then we're going to hear from Maria Wakeham-Hartinen from Finland's Ministry of Justice, and I'll introduce you to them a little bit more in a moment. But first up, we have Estelle Massé, who, as I say, is a policy officer working on fundamental rights policy within DG Just in the European Commission. And I'm sure you're all to some extent aware of the EU civil society strategy. So Estelle's going to walk us through that in a very brief sense, and also talk to us a little bit more about the Commission's wider work in terms of protecting civic space. So, and then after Estelle, we'll have our two other presentations. So each speaker has 5 minutes each, which is a little cruel given the content that they could cover. But we want to make sure we have time for questions and discussion afterwards. So Estelle, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much for the invitation and the introduction to today's discussion. We've indeed covered from the first session quite a lot of the amount of challenges that civic space and civil society at large faces, and that is one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, why the European Commission has decided at the end of last year to adopt its first ever EU civil society strategy. Before giving you a little bit of insight into that strategy that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but where it's important also for us to continue presenting it, I'd like to further frame a little bit the context of this work, because of course it stems from the challenges and the results of monitoring that colleagues in the previous session have explained. But there is also this strategy and this work was a long time coming from the Commission. First, to contextualize in legal terms, as you probably know, there are obligations stemming from the EU treaties and the EU Charter for the EU institutions to engage with civil society. That's foreseen under Article 11 of the Treaty on the European Union. And there is also an overarching obligation to guarantee, protect, and respect freedom of association, freedom of assembly of association that is guaranteed under Article 12 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Now, that may sound very, very legalese and very foreign, but this means that each time EU law is being implemented, the Charter is applicable, and therefore this right to freedom of association exists. Now, because of this work and those principles and those rights that exist in our framework, the EU and the Commission in particular has been working on civic space for a very long time, even if perhaps it was never branded as a specific strand of work. And you can see it in decades of work on rule of law that include civic space monitoring and civic space reporting, on recent reports from the annual report on the Charter of Fundamental Rights, in particular the one from 2020 and 2022 that largely focus on the civic space environment and the role of civil society organization, that then escalated in 2023 through the adoption of Commission recommendation to a member state on how to promote engagement and effective participation with citizen and civil society organization, and then to legislative initiative also that, although they are not specifically designed with civil society in mind, they still were developed with also considering the impact that they would have in supporting civil society as an important actor in Europe. You have that in legislation that address specific risks that civil society may face, such as hate speech legislation, or also specific legislation such as anti-SLAPP legislation that were also designed to respond to particular threats identified that where civil society are some of the specific victims of those threats. And then the last component from the legal, the legislative, and the third component of our work is also the funding that the European Commission has long been provided to civil society and will continue to provide to civil society through important programs like the so-called SURF program, the Citizenship Equality, Rights and Value program that is running until 2027, and then the future program that will include a SURF Plus component under the future Agora EU program that will start once our next budget iteration is adopted. This budget will be at least doubling, hopefully maybe more, we know it's still in discussion, for civil society, and goes to complement the policy work that and legislative work that has been adopting in the EU. But in this context, while the EU has been working indirectly, so to speak, in supporting civic space for many years, there was a gap, and this gap was not having a comprehensive EU civil society strategy. which has been fulfilled now last November, where the strategy was adopted as part of the so-called democracy package, in order to respond to a clear request from stakeholders, mostly civil society, but also other EU institutions. There were calls from the Parliament that were very clear, and also Council conclusion from a member state calling and recalling the importance of civic space and protecting and promoting fundamental rights. And therefore, this is why this is an EU Commission document, but we see it as not only a European document, but a whole society approach, engagement to strengthen engagement, support and protect civil society across Europe, but also to ensure that civil society is adequately funded. This is a really high-level commitment from the Commission. It stems actually from the highest level. The need for this strategy was acknowledged in the political guidelines of the Commission's president and recalled in the mission letter of our Commissioner for Justice, Commissioner Magua. This strategy, which is now about 6 months old, we've started working on its implementation because it's going to be, of course, the most important phase. But for us, its mere existence is also an important acknowledgement that civil society is not only one of the crucial actors to vibrant democracy, and we need to make that acknowledgement more public, in particular at a time where civil society is facing increasing threats. And this is also supposed to be, therefore, a tool to help respond to those threats by, as Andreas explained, by better monitoring them. And so we hope indeed the monitoring network will help us do that, but also developing more appropriate and where they are missing tools at all to ensure protection of civil society. For that, there are different components that will be created, such indeed as those monitoring network and also a knowledge hub to be able to assess the situation that will also guide us on further developing and reflecting on possible protection mechanism. We're also aim to strengthen our engagement with civil society, in particular on issue of civic space, to complement existing dialogue we have in the national context for rule of law, in order to have an EU-wide discussion on civic space, for which we are creating a civil society platform by the end of this year, and for which we're delighted to come with the support of the FRA, but also the ESC and civil society themselves. I'll finish briefly because, of course, we could be talking about the strategy in details for a very long time, but it's important to say two components on the scope of the strategy, not on its content, but the scope. I've been repeatedly saying EU level, but of course it's we know civic space, it's a shared space. So in fact, the scope of the strategy will be EU countries, candidate country and potential candidates. And when I talk also of the EU level, there are several components of that. We want to have a cross EU assessment and proposal for solution, but we will be also working to implement this strategy at national level and working with our member states. Some of them are here today, which is great, to help support on exchange of best practices, implementation of the 2023 recommendation, but also sharing experiences on how to ensure that at national level there are open, safe, and enabling civic space environments so that we can have at European level the same results, basically, and how countries can learn from each other's of strategies and processes that have worked and how to strengthen engagement, and also learn from the positive impact for countries that may be perhaps a little bit more reticent on the positive impact that there has been in other countries when they've opened the door to civil society and created a true seat at the table and constructed meaningful engagement. So we're looking forward to working with our member states on developing those exchanges and developing those forums for best practices, as well as with the FRA and with the OECD on this. And also very happy to be working with OGP through this space and others to ensure that indeed the strategy will be delivered at all of this level, because it was important for the Commission to make that commitment to protecting and supporting civil society, to have this momentum of recognition. But as we all know here, protecting civil society requires a whole society approach, and well, it takes a village, and part of the village is here today, but we hope to be many more to do this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Estelle. Great to hear, and thank you for getting through so much in such a short period of time as well. But really important to have that bar set from the centre at the European Commission level, given everything we've heard about what's happening in terms of the civil society environment, the threats and attacks on civil society, the backtracking on civic space. really crucial to have this document at the center of European Commission, and that conveying that expectation across member states as well. Many of whom who do have national civil society strategies. We're going to hear about a couple more, but some who don't. So great opportunity, including through collaborating with ourselves through the national OGP processes, to see more of those developed in the coming years. So thank you very much for that input, which sets the scene nicely so that we can hear about a couple of specific national civil society strategies. So next up is Kieran Moylan from the Department of Rural and Community Development and the Gaeltacht in Ireland. Kieran is the head of unit in the department, where he has oversight of the Irish government's strategy in support of the community and voluntary sector. And Kieran's unit also hosts the annual Civic Forum for dialogue with the sector in Ireland. So over to you, Kieran, to tell us a little bit more about those aspects. You're just on mute at the moment, Kieran.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so look, I'm delighted to be with you here this afternoon, and just to share with you very briefly some of the work that we've been doing in Ireland in the civic society space. First of all, Ireland adopted its first strategy to support the community and voluntary sector in 2019. The strategy was called Sustainable, Inclusive and Empowered Communities. Here's my well-worn copy here. And the strategy, I think, set a direction in relation to the government's relationship with the community and voluntary sector at both central government level and at local government level, with a particular focus on participation, engagement and support. I think the content of the strategy aligns very well also with the Open Government Partnership civil society participation pillar, which envisages a stronger role for civil society organisations in policy making, both at central government level and also creating a supportive policy and funding environment for the sector. And also it recognises the role of the civil society in local policy making and decision making. Alongside the rollout of that strategy, as part of the discussions with civil society organisations, a set of values and principles for collaboration and partnership working with the sector was agreed. And this was approved by government and has been rolled out across government. And we've prepared one monitoring report on the application of that, and that was produced as part of one of our commitments under the current Open Government Partnership Action Plan as well. A specific action as well that you referred to, Paul, in your opening was the hosting of an annual civic forum for dialogue between government and community sector organisations. The Civic Forum, I suppose, has provided a platform to share best practice examples, particularly in areas like policy, co-design and co-implementation. And we've also used it to demonstrate how the agreed values and principles are working in practice across various policy areas. Just for the interest of participants this afternoon, the theme for the 2026 Civic Forum, which is taking place later this year, will be focused on the EU civil society strategy and also on themes related to safer civic spaces. So this is very much in line with current developments while Ireland holds the presidency of the EU for the next 6 months. In Ireland as well, we have put a lot of emphasis on both creating new structures and also in building on those structures. So for the past 10 years or so, we have had in place a structure for local participation called public participation networks, and they're supported by central government and engage in particular with local government. There are about 20,000 organisations that are members of their local public participation network, and within each local authority area, they select representatives from the sector to be the voice of the sector in various local planning and decision-making structures, and also to provide a structured mechanism for feedback from those local planning and decision-making structures to the community and voluntary sector. And those structures have been evolving and developing since their establishment. It's also worth noting that at national level, there's an increased participation of representative organisations on various stakeholder fora, which are hosted by different government departments and agencies. And these might relate to things like health policy, social inclusion, climate change, sustainable travel. And that's a very welcome development from the relevant organisations in the sector. Central government in Ireland is also developing new guidelines for greater participation in public policy making and to enhance policy legitimacy. And again, that initiative is being progressed as part of a commitment to the Open Government Partnership Action Plan by those relevant departments. I suppose a final point then is over the past 10 months or so, we've been developing a successor to the first strategy, and that's nearing completion, and we hope to see that adopted by our government in the coming months. This will build on the structures, the processes, the achievements of the previous strategy. It's also been informed by the EU civil society strategy, and it's in particular been informed by many of the trends and challenges that have been highlighted earlier in this webinar, and in particular in relation to the need to put in place stronger protections for the sector. So we hope to see that new strategy adopted and published in the coming months. So we're happy to take any questions or comments from anybody, and looking forward to the remainder of the webinar.
Thank you very much, Kieran. We will open up for questions after all the presentations, so that there will be a chance to give people time to think of what they might want to ask you. But thanks for walking us through that. And I'm glad as well you mentioned the upcoming Irish EU presidency, which is, again, it's an opportunity for a country like Ireland, which has comparatively robust civic space, to kind of show leadership across the EU and beyond, indeed. And so we're looking forward to collaborating with yourselves and some of the other organizations here today to see how we can bring that to the fore. So thank you for that. We're going to move on to our final speaker of the panel, which is Maria Wakeham-Hartonen from the Ministry of Justice in Finland, where she's part of the Department of Democracy and Public Law, where she focuses on developing democracy and civil society policies. And she also works as the department's Chief of Staff. So Maria, you're going to talk to us about the civil society strategy. So over to you, and looking forward to hearing about what you're doing in Finland.
Thank you, Paul, and good afternoon to all. Can I have my slides, please? Great. Thank you. So I'll briefly present Finland's civil society organization strategy as part of this broader discussion on civic space in Europe, with the focus on how national level policy can respond to concerns about democratic resilience and participation. So perhaps we'll move to the next slide, please. Yeah. So Finland's CSO strategy is a government resolution adopted in 2024, building a long-term work to strengthen civil society. And its core operating idea is a whole of government approach, responding to, for example, an OECD civic space scan of Finland in 2021 recommendation for more coherence across ministries. And the implementation of the strategy has included increased dialogue with civil society, and it's also supported by advisory boards and structured cooperation. But it has to be noted that while Finland, we perform quite well internationally, civic space cannot be taken for granted, and we do share many of the challenges mentioned in the previous interventions, such as funding uncertainty, growing inequalities in participation, structural changes in how people engage, and so forth. So this is why the CSO strategy is also linked to a broader policy framework. We have National Democracy Program, which focuses on strengthening democratic structures and participation practices. And then we have the Fundamental and Human Rights Action Plan. And together these three projects aim at forming a more coherent policy framework for participation and civic space during this term of government until 2027. Moreover, this strategy does build on sustained long-term development. It also aligns closely with the EU civil society strategy. And obviously the results and impacts of the strategy measures, we can assess them in the coming years more precisely. Shall we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So here you can see that our CSO strategy focuses on 5 main goals, especially on practical side enabling conditions. These relate mainly to fundraising, reforming government grant activities, and reducing administrative burden. There's also a goal on increasing access to EU funding and promoting volunteering. And we are investing in data and monitoring just to better understand civic space. So the actions actually involve a mix of legislative projects, studies, and then there are also other activities. As regards to the legislative projects, we've had a project for expanding tax deductibility of donations to CSOs. We've worked on legislation reforming the Act on Discretionary Government Grants, and also reforming the Associations Acts and the Register of Associations. The studies have focused on developing regulation and administrative practices relating to CSOs, also reforming government grant practices and municipal and wellbeing services county grants. Another study has touched strengthening CSO's capacity to apply for project funding in the EU. Then there are also other ongoing activities. We have been building these CSO indicators to better monitor the development of civic space, to be able to better respond to the challenges that may arise from that. And we've been improving interaction between public administration and civil society. For example, the national OGP actions and also the democracy program. There's also a formulation of a vision for civil society, how the government can better promote and cooperate with the CSO. And this is an ongoing effort. I hope I still have some time, so if we take the next one. So I was asked to bring up some bright points. So with a little self-reflection, I said there will be an evaluation later on, but perhaps just briefly some challenges and successes of the strategy project so far. So the positive development side, there has been a stronger whole of government approach to promoting civic space, and we've been able perhaps to have more institutionalized participation, meaning that inviting CSOs, umbrella organization and advisory boards, for example, into a working group, and creating dialogues and so forth. We've been able to have practical reforms to funding and regulation, which has been an achievement itself, which hasn't been, for example, this tax deductions issue has been an aim of some CSOs for decades, and now it's happening. And obviously, it's very important that we've been able to move towards more evidence-based policy making. And I think it's also a very good thing that the strategy is well aligned with the EU civil society's policy, the OGP principles, such as the transparency and participation. And we've had a lot of support from institutions, from FRA, the OECD, as well as peers from other countries. And there's been also a lot of interest towards our strategy. The challenges may include perhaps limited scope. We focus on CSOs. This is a political choice. The time is limited, so we have to start with the legislative projects and then do the vision a bit later on. The resources are scarce, so perhaps more cooperation and communication with stakeholders would have been hoped for. Coordination across ministries is working, but obviously our role is to coordinate and we do not steer, so we cannot really affect the schedules or the timing, how different actions go forward. And challenges perhaps to ensure the meaningful participation in the way that perhaps some stakeholders have felt that that they would have wanted a bit more ambitious goals than what we have, and or what we were able to deliver. We cannot compensate cuts in government grants through this strategy, but we can perhaps support other prerequisites, such as fundraising possibilities for them. But overall, I think the approach combines structured dialogue tradition with practical reforms to support sustainability of civil society strategy. I have one more slide, and I'm sorry if I'm taking too much time, but perhaps just if you look at the future, I think the key idea is that while we need this targeted strategy, it must still reflect a comprehensive cross-government approach to support civil society. And this means looking at policies as a whole, I mean, across ministries and levels of administration, and we need to link them to open government and trust-building efforts. And there are several shifts that are important in the future. We need to have policy tools and regulations that enable civic space rather than restricts it. And secondly, major structural changes, especially AI transformations and media environment, they're reshaping how civil society operates and engages, and these must be better reflected in our policy approach. And thirdly, there are clear tensions that we must address. For example, fiscal constraints and cuts affecting CSOs, they can undermine strategic goals to strengthen civil society. And at the same time, there are positive signs in Finland. I mean, as said, progress on tax deductibility of donations, growing interest in EU project funding, and increasingly network cooperation to improve operating conditions for civil society organizations. So overall, the challenge and the opportunity is to ensure that our strategy remains focused, but it's implemented in the way that it mobilizes the whole public administration and responds to these systemic changes. But for more information, I have some links and materials in my slideshow, and I'm happy to continue the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for that comprehensive overview, and also for the honest assessment of the strengths and also the challenges that still need to be addressed, and perhaps future iterations of the strategy can continue to progress towards some of those. So we're going to bring all the panelists back together from both panels. And this is where we're going to open out to see what questions we might have from our participants today. As I said, we're particularly interested in being pragmatic and solution oriented here. So if people have other examples that they want to share of ongoing reforms or potential reforms, that would be interesting. Also, how OGP national processes can help move reform discussions forward, or if you want to probe a little bit more into something that one or other panelist has said, then that would be great. I see a couple of questions in the chat already from Beatrice. So maybe I'll come to those first while others are thinking. There are a couple of different issues in there. One is about the intersection between right to information and civic space. So I'm not sure if anybody wants to comment on that. But there is also the issue of monitoring, evidence-based monitoring, that is referred to as well. And I know that's been a key pillar of what several people have said. And I think, Katarina, you had suggested it might be useful to kind of reflect a little bit more on that. So maybe I'll come to you first on that, and others can, perhaps you could raise hands, other panelists, if you'd like to contribute. And if I could just ask people to keep their inputs brief so that we can also get to other questions and comments from participants. So Katarina, over to you first.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And I just want to recognize the importance of monitoring that both Karin and Andreas said. And it is about like, why do you monitor? What kind of information you get, you want to get out of it? What do you do with that information? To what kind of information you give credibility? And I think at the moment, I guess the messages we are trying to convey is that there is enough data and information about the key pressures on civil society in the field. And of course, we have to continue monitoring and trying to understand how they're manifesting to work with solutions. But what we really need to be braver is in picking up the signals of change and trusting that they can become pattern that can then evolve in a restriction or in an opportunity. And I think this is where we are really weak, because we, for the issue of closing space, I mean, if we put honestly this webinar 10 years ago, we will be raising some of these issues. And that's because we've been grappling with them. But they are becoming bigger and bigger, because when they started, we took us some time to understand the connections, the kind of patterns that are happening, to realize that it can happen in democracies, not just in very authoritarian spaces. And I guess what I'm arguing for is a more bold approach, where we say we are monitoring and looking for signals of change. We are trusting even if they do not become and manifest as strongly, and we will act upon them even when they're in that early stage. And I think that's something that we are really keen to explore with all of our partners into how we can do that better, and then also match the different response mechanisms that can come on such level, whether it is from institutions or governments or other actors in the society. So I guess that's the moment which we really need to capitalize on opportunities and prevent what might be as a closing space. So I would really like to add that pre-early warning mechanism to our monitoring and reaction patterns.
Thanks, Katarina. Do any of the other panelists want to comment on this question of monitoring? Estelle and Andreas. We'll go to Estelle first and then Andreas.
Thank you. I think also to address the two questions from Beatrice a bit together on the importance of the monitoring, and also the issue of monitoring data not being consistent. This is indeed something that I think we all acknowledge, that the monitoring has been extremely important to put the finger on the challenges. What exists already is extremely useful, but indeed in order to be able to act, it would act on it, which is of course the useful part of having this monitoring, is also to be able to develop solutions to address the issues identified. It would be important to have this consistency in terms of criteria or in terms of indicator and mechanism use, so that we have a quite comprehensive set of information that is comparable also from one place to another as much as possible, in order to help us from the side of the Commission, but also other policymakers, to develop solutions. And so this is why also in the strategy, we have tasked kindly the FRA to develop this monitoring network, which they are working on, but also a knowledge hub, an online knowledge hub, to gather this monitoring and try to organize a little bit those findings so that it's more easily findable. So it's not about reinventing the wheel, because a lot of really important monitoring is already existing and there is no need to repeat what's already there, but to find places where it needs to be complemented. And this is also a place where we're also going to be working with the OECD on additional surveys and information gathering to have this consolidated set of information. So here again, I think from information already existing from CSOs, from new work from FRA and OECD, we're hoping to work on this consolidated point in order to be able to act on action. But at least on the issue identified by Beatrice and colleagues on this point, I think there is an agreement on both the importance of this monitoring, the need to be able to act on it, but the fact that it needs to be somewhat organized a little bit further in order to get to that step.
Thanks, Estelle. Andreas?
Not much to add to what Estelle and Katarina has said, but just maybe one additional element. I do think that maybe what we also need to, beyond what was said, where maybe we want to be a little bit better is this picking up on early warning signals. I think that could, because I think once the situation has already deteriorated, then in a way you don't need. I mean, then it's so obvious to everyone that it's the monitoring is almost less important. But I do think where the monitoring could maybe be a little bit more granular and also maybe more innovative is what are these early warning signals and how do we detect them and how can we also have some sort of preventative mechanism so that things don't get worse. So that's something that I hope in this monitoring network group we could also discuss. And then for the rest, I think it's very important that we are, I mean, Estelle, you said it, we are half of the villages here already. I think, speaking a little bit with one voice, I think that could maybe help because, it's the complementarity of the data. I mean, Karin was speaking about the data that they're collecting from governments. There's a lot of civil society monitoring. There's, monitoring by international organizations. I think if we can kind of say that this is sort of the complete picture on how civic space is developing in the European Union and beyond, it will be very difficult to kind of dismiss politically that data if it comes from so many different sources. And then it's not, maybe just FRA or just a civil society coalition having reported these trends, but it's really an entire, Katarina, you said it, a coalition of organizations. So I hope we are moving into that direction and with this next steps. And for me, I do think I'm hopeful that we will make really progress on this, with the support of this implementation of the civil society strategy. Now, for the first time, we have really a strong, also political push from Brussels, and I think that's great.
Thanks, Andreas. I'll come to Corinne next, because I know you need to go in a couple of minutes. So if you wanted to comment anything further on that, on the questions that came in from Beatrice, but there is also a question from Louise in the chat in relation to the question of public trust. From data information available, what practical measures have proven most effective in building public trust in civil society organizations in polarized environments? So given the OECD's extensive work on public trust, you might have some reflections on that. And then, yes, we are running out of time, so I'll come maybe briefly to Johnny's comment in the chat, but then we'll probably need to wrap up. So if there are any urgent final questions or comments from panelists, please raise your hand and we'll come to you.
Thank you. I'll try to be quick. So on the first question on access to information, our global report on civic space does cover it as an essential element to strengthen and protect civic space. Just really quickly, what we're seeing is that essentially, without reliable access to public information, citizens cannot meaningfully engage or monitor government or influence policy. So there are a couple of points that you can find on the report, but it's essentially about the fact that, yes, strong legal frameworks exist in most countries, but implementation gaps are an issue. Proactive disclosure is as important as reactive access. There's the issue of digitalization that creates both opportunities and risks with regards to access to information. And the last 2 points we link with access to information in civic spaces on media freedom and pluralism and on the protection of whistleblowers and civic actors. The global report was published at a time right after COVID-19, so there was an element of emergencies and crises and how that can restrict access, and that was another element that was useful that came up. On trust specifically, if you just Google OECD drivers of trust in public institutions, you will get a lot of information. But essentially what we're seeing on what governments can do is around 4 or 5 kind of categories. The first one is, as I've mentioned, and that's why the work on open government, civic space, etc., it's linked to better engaging with citizens. This is the most essential part, as I've mentioned in my speech. The second element is strengthening capacity around how governments are addressing complex policy challenges transparently. So there's an element of how you can strengthen the transparency around measures that are being taken. There's a really big chunk on the healthy information ecosystem and investing in evidence-based communication. So the whole element of sometimes essentially citizens are not necessarily aware of existing measures, existing policies, and how they impact them. So that's another element that can help strengthen trust. And then there's an element around the reliability and responsiveness and fairness of public services. So generally in OECD countries, a majority express satisfaction with services, with public services, and this has a correlation with higher levels of trust. But improving really the speed, the ease of core classic administrative service delivery is something that we know in our research can have an impact on this. But it's 200 pages of report on drivers of trust available online for you to read through.
Great, and maybe you could post the link to that in the chat. Well, with apologies to Johnny, as we are running short on time, and I want to pass to Tim as well before we finish, because he's going to explain a little bit about OGP's Civic Space Lab program. But maybe just in relation to Johnny's question, which I don't want to get completely lost, which is around the Irish presidency and any advice from panelists around ensuring that the values of the civil society strategy and civic space as an issue are highlighted through that process. So maybe I could ask anyone who wants to respond just to respond in the chat. We can always connect you afterwards. If you could just respond as a chat reply to Johnny, that would be very helpful. But in the interest of finishing on time, I'm going to hand back to Tim to round us off. But thank you to all of our panelists. It's been an excellent discussion, always insufficient time. But this is only one of many different ways in which we're working together on civic space. So hopefully this has given us some ideas for future collaboration as well.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to our panelists. So we did just want to finish by talking a little bit about how OGP can help to support on the topic of civic space. So there are three things I particularly want to highlight. One that Paul mentioned at the very beginning is that countries have already used the OGP platform to make commitments on civic space. So as he said, there have been 79 commitments to date across 23 European countries on civic space. There has been a tail off over the past few years, so we would really encourage you to, as you have your conversations around your open government action plans, to really prioritise civic space as a part of that. Second thing I want to highlight that was also mentioned, I think, by Katerina and others, is the OpenGov Challenge, which was launched last year. And so there we're looking to essentially collect together the most ambitious commitments around different topics, including civic space. So we would also really encourage you to consider reforms you're undertaking as part of the challenge. If they don't necessarily need to be part of an action plan, they can be a standalone commitment. So that's another avenue you can use to hopefully make civic space reforms. The final one is the Civic Space Lab that we launched last year with a number of partner organisations. And essentially the idea behind the Civic Space Lab is to provide the incentives and support to governments to help them to take leadership on civic space. So essentially breaks down into two different parts. Firstly, we have the leaders group, and the idea there is we'll bring together small groups of action-focused coalitions, so countries who are working collectively together around common issues on civic space. A couple that we particularly have in mind for the next year that we've spoken about on this webinar are around developing civil society or civic space strategies, and then also participation mechanisms for civil society in policy and decision making as well. So look out for opportunities to be involved in those. And the final or the second kind of strand of the Civic Space Lab is something called the Reformers Programme. And the idea there is to provide support to countries who have the ambition to make civic space reforms via OGP. So if you're interested in that, please do get in touch as well. So just to finish off, we wanted to do one final Mentimeter, and here we were interested to hear from you in what support do you need to progress civic space reforms in your country. So please go ahead and add any ideas that come to mind there. We'll keep this open for a bit after the meeting as well, so you can also be thinking on it and adding to it maybe over the next hour or two. And final thing that I will finish off by saying is we will send an email to follow up from this webinar. We'll include the recording of the webinar, but we will also include links to a lot of the resources that have been mentioned during the webinar by our different panelists as well. So do look out for that. It will be a good kind of resource of kind of reminders of what's been discussed. So I think that's everything for today. We've got a few answers already starting to come into the Mentimeter, so please do respond to that. But otherwise, thank you very much for your time today, and looking forward to seeing you on another webinar at some point in the future.